Morrison's probably too emotionally invested because she works with defectives. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before a military convoy rolled into Seattle General with enough firepower to occupy a small country. He didn't know who he was talking about. Neither did the two residents standing at the vending machine, pretending to debate between Coke and Sprite while their ears caught every word. They didn't know that the nurse restocking the supply cart 3 aisles away had trained combat medics under fire. They didn't know that her hands had held more lives together in Ramadi than most surgeons see in a career. They didn't know what was coming. Katie Morrison moved through the 7th floor of Seattle General with the kind of practiced invisibility that comes from 8 months of blending in. Her scrubs were pressed, not crisp like Whitfield's, but neat enough to be forgettable. Her stride was efficient, her eye contact brief and deferential. She checked for lines the way 1,000 other nurses checked for lines. She updated charts without flourish. She existed in the quiet spaces between the important people, which was exactly where she needed to be. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant buzz, a sound like wasps trapped in plastic. She'd gotten used to it. Not the way civilians got used to it, by ignoring it. The way soldiers got used to sounds that meant danger, by listening through them, cataloging every variance. The hum tonight had a slight electrical tick to it. Probably needed ballast replacement in the West Corridor. Not her problem. Not anymore. In her locker, wrapped in a clean handkerchief, sat a tarnished challenge coin. Bronze dull to brown, edges worn smooth from 14 years of handling. The weight of it was familiar in her palm. She touched it once every shift, not a ritual, not prayer, just acknowledgement. Her son had pressed it into her hand 3 weeks before his last mission and said, "Keep the old man alive." The old man was a call sign. The old man was the deaf veteran from Ramadi who'd led Special Forces operations and happened to be her son's commanding officer. The old man was also, as of 23 minutes ago, arriving at Seattle General with cardiac complications from shrapnel position so close to his heart that the ER doctors would be making decisions in minutes, not hours. She'd been waiting for this admission for 6 months. The charge nurse announced it over the intercom at 6:02 p.m., incoming trauma to emergency. ETA 8 minutes. Deaf male, 63 years old, cardiac symptoms, foreign body near left ventricle, alert and cooperative. Katie was updating post-op vitals on a cardiac patient in Bedford when she heard it. Her hands didn't pause. Her breathing didn't change. But something shifted in her chest, not fear. Fear was useless. It was more like a rifle bolt sliding home. Certainty. Readiness. The sensation you got when all the training finally had a target. She finished the charting, checked the monitors one last time, and moved toward the supply station with the kind of unhurried pace that wouldn't draw attention. Through the glass partition, she could see the ER doors. The ambulance would arrive in 6 minutes. That's when she saw him. Dr. Sterling Whitfield moved through the hospital like he owned the building and was disappointed with his real estate investment. 56 years old, Harvard Medical, inherited wealth written in the cut of his suit, and a contempt for patients that managed to feel clinical and personal at the same time. He had 3 residents trailing behind him, young, eager, still naive enough to think that competence was the most important quality in a physician. They were walking toward the vending machines. Katie was 13 feet away, her back to them, hands occupied with 4 fluid bags. The incoming admission, Whitfield said, his voice carrying the particular volume of someone who didn't care who heard him. Deaf veteran. Ramadi. Probably brain damage on top of the hearing loss. You see this in the older generation, multiple combat deployments, exposure to IEDs. The neurological damage compounds. You end up with a patient who can't communicate, can't process complex information, and frankly, can't consent to major procedures. Katie's jaw clenched. Just slightly. Enough that her teeth fit together with a small click. Her hands continued moving. That's exactly why we need to document everything, Whitfield continued. Limited communication capacity makes informed consent legally problematic. If something goes wrong, we need to be protected. I'm already thinking we refuse anything invasive until the family gets here. Let someone else handle the liability. One of the residents, a young woman with auburn hair and the exhausted eyes of someone in month 4 of residency, said quietly, "But sir, the triage note says he's fully alert. He communicates through sign language. His daughter is listed as POA Anne." Sign language, Whitfield interrupted, and Katie heard him smile in his voice. Not exactly legal documentation. Not in a courtroom. We'll assess when he arrives. But my initial recommendation is conservative. Very conservative. The vending machine swallowed his dollar bill with a mechanical hiss. Katie placed the 4 bags on the shelf with the kind of deliberate care that said she had heard nothing, seen nothing, retained nothing. Her expression was neutral, the expression of someone thinking about dinner or her car payment or anything except the conversation happening 3 aisles away. It was a skill she'd learned at Fort Bragg and perfected in Ramadi, how to stand in a room and be invisible. But her left hand, the one with the faded scars along the forearm where shrapnel had creased her skin, trembled slightly. Not from fear. From the effort of not moving. From muscle memory screaming at her to act, to correct, to fix this. From restraint. She reached into her scrub pocket and touched the challenge coin once. Bronze warm from her body temperature. Smooth edges worn by her son's hand. Her thumb found the imprint where his call sign had been stamped, Razor. He'd carried this coin for 9 years. He'd pressed it into her hand with the weight of an order. Keep the old man alive. The challenge coin went back into her pocket. The ER doors would open in approximately 4 minutes. The old man would come through them still breathing, still conscious, still having no idea that the hospital system designed to save his life was already making calculations about his liability. Katie turned from the supply station with her empty cart and moved toward the main corridor, her pace exactly the same as before, her face revealing nothing. But there was a calculation happening behind her eyes, the kind of tactical assessment that gets taught in the Naval Amphibious Warfare School, where you walk into a room and you count exits, identify threats, process angles of fire, and understand that everything happening around you is information and everything you do next is either a decision or a mistake. She passed the vending machines without looking at Whitfield or the residents. They didn't look up. They were discussing the upcoming clinical review board meeting. In Whitfield's mind, she was already gone, a forgettable nurse from the day shift, beneath his notice, incapable of understanding the subtleties of medical decision-making and malpractice risk. The ER arrived in a controlled chaos that was exactly controlled chaos. The ambulance crew brought the veteran in on a stretcher at 6:55 p.m., 6 minutes before the predicted ETA, which meant he was stable enough to move quickly, which was good, or his condition was deteriorating fast, which was not. Katie couldn't tell yet. She was in the main corridor when they wheeled past, and she got one look at the patient before he disappeared through the double doors. The old man was 63 years old with silver-grey hair and the kind of face that had weathered serious things. His hands were making small, controlled movements, not panic, not distress, but the measured signs of someone explaining something to people who couldn't hear him. His daughter stood beside the stretcher, a woman in her mid-30s with the same composed bearing, her hands moving in rapid sign language as she walked. The two of them were communicating clearly, fluently, in a language as precise and detailed as any spoken English. Whitfield was already moving toward the ER, his coat flaring behind him like he was entering a theater. Katie watched him go, and she touched the challenge coin in her pocket one more time. The next 8 minutes would determine whether the old man left this hospital alive or in a flag-draped box. And she was the only person in this building who understood that the threat wasn't the shrapnel near his heart. The threat was the man in the $3,000 suit who'd already decided to let him die. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't do anything about it. Not yet. Not as long as she was just a nurse named Katie Morrison, with a clean background and no authority and a uniform that meant she was supposed to follow orders, not give them. She was 8 months into a cover that required her to watch this unfold and stay invisible. That was the mission. Except her son was already dead. Her son had died in Ramadi 3 months ago, 2 weeks before she'd transferred to Seattle General for this assignment. He'd been killed on a mission led by the old man. and the challenge coin in her pocket carried the weight of a promise that transcended hospital protocol and chain of command and everything about the nurse named Katie Morrison who didn't officially exist. She moved toward the ER doors at a walk, not a run. Her pace was steady. Her breathing was steady. But her hands, if anyone had been watching, were steady in the way that comes right before violence, the kind of calm that isn't peace, but the absence of hesitation. The ER waiting room was filling with people. Family members. Another veteran with a prosthetic leg who clearly knew the old man from some unit or deployment. And Dr. Whitfield, who was already gesturing at the patient like he was a lab specimen, his mouth moving in words Katie couldn't hear but didn't need to. She'd already heard enough. She took the direct route to the supply room, grabbed what she'd need, and moved toward the observation window where she could watch the assessment without being obviously present. Just a nurse doing her job. Just a person getting equipment ready. Just someone holding a challenge coin in her pocket so tightly that her fingernails left crescents in the palm of her hand. The room went dead silent when Whitfield stopped talking. Grand rounds at Seattle General moved with the precision of a military formation, 12 residents and 4 attending physicians orbiting Dr. Whitfield as he stopped at the bed in Trauma Bay 3. The deaf veteran lay propped at 30 degrees, his chart labeled with his service number instead of his name, the kind of small erasure that happens when a patient becomes a teaching moment instead of a person. Whitfield gestured toward him the way a curator might indicate a specimen behind glass. "Observe," he announced, his voice carrying across the ward with the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned in his life. "Limited communication capacity makes informed consent legally problematic. We have policy concerns here." The old man tried to sign something, a response, maybe a question, and Whitfield mimicked the hand movements back to him, a grotesque mirror that made 3 residents suppress smiles. The patient's face went blank. Not because he couldn't see the mockery, he could, perfectly clearly, but because he'd survived Ramadi, survived IED blasts and ambushes and the kind of trauma that teaches you when to stay silent. Katie Morrison stood at the perimeter, clipboard in hand, her face absolutely neutral even as her fingernails pressed crescents into the pen she held. She'd learned that look in 18 years of field medicine, intense under mortar fire, in moments when showing anything could get your team killed. "We can't treat what we can't communicate with," Whitfield continued, turning to address his audience fully now, his back to the patient. "This is a liability issue, people. Documentation becomes impossible. Informed consent becomes untenable. Hospital counsel would shut this down in minutes." He said it like it was already decided, like the doctors around him had simply come to verify a foregone conclusion instead of make one. Katie watched the residents' faces, some uncertain, some nodding along because Whitfield was the attending and the attending was always right, some already mentally moving on to the next patient, the next rotation, the next convenient reason not to be inconvenienced. The veteran's monitor beeped its steady rhythm in the background, a sound like a metronome counting down. By 10:51 a.m., 6 more attending physicians had materialized. Each one consulted quietly with Whitfield, conversations that took exactly 4 minutes apiece, conversations Katie recognized as theater rather than deliberation. Each one reviewed the chart, nodded, and departed with nearly identical language about communication barriers and consent complications and risk mitigation protocols. Language that didn't exist in hospital policy until Whitfield had planted it like seeds in the morning briefing, that required attendance meeting where he'd spent 17 minutes discussing liability frameworks that had never been an issue before this patient arrived. 7 doctors total. 7 refusals. The number hung in the air like a sentence Katie couldn't interrupt. She tried anyway. At 11:15 a.m., she approached the attending station and requested a cardiology consult in the precise clinical language she'd used when briefing SEAL team commanders about field triage decisions. "His cardiac enzymes are trending upward. The shrapnel near his heart creates progressive risk as scar tissue remodels. He needs intervention before." The cardiology attending didn't even look at his chart. Dr. Whitfield indicated there were consent issues. That was it. A sentence. No examination, no review of labs, no human conversation about the human lying in bed 3. Just deference to a hierarchy that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with power. At 12:34 p.m., she tried again with the trauma surgeon, catching him at the cafeteria with coffee still steaming. "Sir, I need to flag a patient deteriorating in trauma bay 3. Combat-related injury, shrapnel proximity to cardiac structures." The surgeon's expression shifted, became polite but distant. "Is there a consult order?" Katie hesitated. She didn't have one, couldn't get one, and the surgeon's face confirmed that hesitation was all the answer he needed. "Then I can't see him." "Have his team placed the order through appropriate channels?" His hands were steady as he lifted his coffee, took a sip, looked past her. She recognized that look too. It was the look of someone who'd learned that going against consensus was harder than going along with it, that a career survived by not making trouble, that 7 doctors refusing treatment was 7 votes against 1 nurse's concern. The coffee in Katie's hands went tepid as she stood in the break room at 1:03 p.m., stirring it methodically. 1 rotation. 2. 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. 11. 12. 13. 14. 15. 16. 17. The spoon circled the cup in a precise spiral, and she was aware of her own breathing the way she'd been aware of it in Ramadi, controlled, measured, the kind of breath you took when your body wanted to move but your mind was ordering it still. Another nurse passed by, glanced at her, looked away quickly. Katie's face was showing nothing, but something in her posture was broadcasting that she was one wrong word away from something, and Seattle General's nurses had learned to recognize that particular frequency of quiet. At 2:33 p.m., Whitfield cornered her at the attending station. He didn't touch her, but he positioned his body to block her path with the kind of casual dominance that made clear this wasn't a conversation, it was a pronouncement. "Nurse Morrison, if you continue harassing medical staff, I will have security escort you out of this unit. Are we clear?" His voice was pleasant, conversational even, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. His smile was the smile of someone who'd never experienced consequences, who believed that volume, uncertainty and the right family connections were the same thing as being right. Katie's jaw tightened, just once, a single clench, but her voice came out steady and deferential, the voice she'd trained herself to use for 8 months of hiding in plain sight. "Yes, doctor." "Good." Whitfield moved, released the space, and Katie walked back to the veteran's bedside. Her gait was unchanged. Her shoulders remained level. Her breathing didn't accelerate. Any observer would have seen only compliance, only a nurse returning to her duties, only the normal functioning of hospital hierarchy. No observer would have seen the woman beneath the scrubs calculating, processing, understanding that Whitfield had just declared war on her mission with the confidence of someone who'd never met anyone who'd been trained to fight in ways he couldn't even perceive. The supply closet door was heavy, made of industrial plastic and equipped with a lock that smelled like disinfectant and human history. Katie entered at 3:16 p.m. during what was technically her break, though everyone on the unit knew breaks were fiction, that nurses didn't actually leave the floor, they just found small spaces where the chaos could be briefly compressed. She pulled out the challenge coin from her scrub pocket, tarnished silver, the kind of worn that came from being carried for years, for decades even, and gripped it until the edges cut into her palm. The coin had belonged to her son. Before Ramadi, before the ambush, before 3 months of silence and casualty notification officers and a folded flag that didn't feel real because it was too heavy and too light all at once. He'd pressed it into her hand during their last conversation, the one where he'd used the secure line to tell her about the mission, about the old man, the Master Chief Petty Officer who'd trained him, who'd led from the front, who'd saved his life 7 times in the desert and probably 8, but neither of them counted the first one. "If anything happens to me," her son had said, his voice steady the way her voice was now, the way their voices both were when discussing things that mattered too much to let feeling into, "Keep the old man alive, Mom. Whatever it takes. He comes first. Promise me." She'd promised. Then Ramadi happened the way terrible things happen when commanders make the kind of split-second decisions that save some lives and end others, and Katie had gotten the notification at 03 for 7 hours while she was sleeping in her civilian apartment in San Antonio, and the Navy had called 4 hours later and asked her if she was ready for an assignment, and she'd said yes because the alternative was accepting that her son's debt had died with him. So they'd planted her as a nurse at Seattle General 8 months ago, given her a cover identity that held up to background checks, and told her the old man would arrive eventually and that her job was to keep him alive until the extraction team could move him. She hadn't expected him to show up with a condition that was medically interesting. She definitely hadn't expected 7 doctors in a row to look at him and decide he was worth less than the liability he represented. The coin pressed into her palm until pain became information, and Katie let it be information. Pain was clarity. Pain was data. Pain was the physical equivalent of the thing her son had understood before he died, that some promises mattered more than comfort, more than safety, more than following the rules of systems that had already failed you. She breathed. She counted her breaths. At breath 22, she felt something in her sternum unlock slightly, felt the pressure redistribute from explosive to manageable, felt her hand steady back to the baseline precision that had kept 47 people alive in Ramadi and had kept her employed here for 8 months without anyone asking questions they shouldn't ask. At 3:42 p.m., Katie returned to the floor. Her face showed nothing. Her movements were efficient. She checked the veteran's vitals: O2 sat 94, heart rate 102, blood pressure 118/76, all numbers that were trending toward a problem but hadn't quite crossed into crisis yet. She updated his chart with the precision of someone documenting a patient she was taking seriously, which was to say, the precision of someone who'd learned that paper trails mattered, that dates and times and observed values created the evidence that outlasted anyone's opinion of what was actually true. The veteran's eyes tracked her, and she gave him nothing, no sign of her mission, no indication that she was anything other than the nurse who'd been assigned to his care, no betrayal of the fact that she was carrying the weight of someone else's son in her pocket. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching his cardiac enzymes climb through the afternoon, watching his oxygen saturation slide incrementally downward, watching the monitor trace patterns that she recognized from 18 years of field medicine as the signature of an internal problem that didn't care about hospital policy or attending physician consensus or the convenient fiction that liability was more important than life. At 4:06 p.m., she called cardiology again and requested a stat consult. No answer. At 5:15 p.m., she paged the on-call surgeon. The pager buzzed back, "Confirm attending order." There was no attending order. There would be no attending order. Whitfield had made that perfectly clear when he'd said 7 doctors had already declined to participate. At 5:42 p.m., Katie made her final attempt. She found Whitfield in his office, a space designed to communicate authority, mahogany desk, soft leather chair, the kind of room that didn't feel like it belonged to a person so much as a position. She presented the veteran's declining stats in the precise clinical language she'd learned from SEAL instructors, the language that left no room for argument because it was simply data, simply fact, simply the observable reality of a human being moving incrementally toward crisis. His shrapnel is shifting. His cardiac enzymes are elevated and climbing. He needs intervention in the next 2 hours or we're going to lose him. Whitfield didn't look up from his computer. We've already established our position on this patient, Nurse Morrison. 7 attending physicians have documented the consent issue. We're not exposing the hospital to liability. The number hung there between them like an accusation. 7. As if 7 refusals made something true, made it real, made it defensible. As if consensus created reality instead of just being the collective agreement of people who were all looking in the same direction and calling it truth. His shrapnel is shifting, Katie said again, and her voice didn't change, didn't rise, didn't crack. He needs intervention in the next. Or nothing, Whitfield interrupted. This conversation is over. Return to your duties. He made a typing motion, a small gesture that said his attention was already gone, that she'd already been forgotten, that her concerns had registered at approximately the volume of a fly at a window. Katie stood there for 2 seconds, the kind of stand that communicated what words couldn't, the kind of stand that made clear she understood exactly what was happening and that she was filing it away in the part of her mind that kept score. Then she turned and left. The break room was empty when Katie entered alone at 6:23 p.m. She made 2 phone calls, both to numbers that rang twice and disconnected without words, a signal not a conversation, the kind of communication that didn't exist in any official record. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. 2 rings meant the extraction team needed to move. 2 rings meant the civilian cover was compromised. 2 rings meant the mission parameters had changed and there would be consequences for refusing to play the game anymore. At 6:02 p.m., Katie returned to Trauma Bay 3 to find the veteran's monitor alarming, his rhythm deteriorating, scar tissue from Ramadi finally shifting enough to compromise the heart muscle beneath. She hit the code button and counted down from 60, the way you did when the code team was supposed to be minutes away. The intercom crackled. Nothing came. She pressed it again. Nothing. She stood there at the bedside of the only person in this hospital who mattered, the old man who'd trained her son, who'd led the ambush that killed him, who'd probably saved her son's life enough times that the count got confusing, and she understood with perfect clarity that she was standing at the exact moment when 8 months of hiding ended and whatever came next began. The afternoon light slanted across the veteran's monitors in that particular way that made numbers look worse than they were. Katie watched the cardiac rhythm on the screen, still sinus, still regular, but the pattern was changing. The way the QT interval was lengthening. The way his blood pressure had drifted down by 6 points in the last hour. The way his oxygen saturation kept climbing despite the room air he was breathing, which meant his lungs were working harder than they should be. She recognized this cascade. She'd seen it in a phi base outside Ramadi 14 years ago, watched a corpsman named Delgado track the exact same deterioration in a Marine with shrapnel lodged near his left ventricle, watched Delgado's face go quiet when he understood what was coming. The scar tissue from the veteran's injury, the shrapnel that had lodged during that same ambush, the one that had killed her son 3 months later, that scar tissue was beginning to move. Not much. Not visibly. But on the monitors it was visible in a dozen small ways that most nurses wouldn't track, that most nurses wouldn't even notice, and Katie noticed everything because noticing was the only thing keeping her alive. She updated the chart at 2:14 p.m. Sinus tachycardia, 98 beats per minute. Blood pressure 112/68, down from 118/72 at noon. O2 sat 97% on room air. Respiratory rate 18. She wrote the numbers in the precise handwriting she'd maintained for 8 months, the civilian handwriting, the nurse handwriting, the one that looked nothing like the operational log she used to fill out at Camp Lejeune. The veteran's eyes tracked her movements from the bed. He couldn't hear, but he could read her face like a tactical map, and she knew her face was revealing nothing because her face never revealed anything when it mattered, but her hands gripped the pen just slightly too hard and she forced herself to relax them. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt heavier than it should. 3 ounces of tarnished metal that her son had carried for 4 years and pressed into her palm the night before his deployment with the words, "Keep the old man alive." Not alive with the understanding that he meant someday. He meant always. He meant whatever it takes. By 2:16 p.m., Katie's jaw had clenched tight enough to taste copper. The monitors showed what was happening inside his chest even though the monitors were just electrons and light and medical approximations. The scar tissue wasn't just shifting, it was pulling. She could see it in the way his ST segment was starting to deviate, in the way his T waves were flattening in leads 2 and 3, in the way his left axis deviation was changing. His blood pressure had dropped another 4 points. His heart was beginning to fail. Not yet. Not in the way that would trigger alarms. Not in the way that would summon the code team who had refused him 7 different times, who had all looked at each other that morning when Dr. Whitfield planted the lie about consent policies, who had all nodded like synchronized swimmers before the day even began. But soon. Within the hour, maybe less. Katie pulled up the code team roster on the computer at the nurse's station. Chen was in the ICU with a septic patient. Reeves was in the surgical wing, already scrubbed in for an emergency appendectomy. Correlson was in the ER main area, 30 yards away, but his trauma activation sound was muted because he was on a personal call, his back turned, his posture relaxed in the way of people who didn't think anyone needed him right now. And Dr. Whitfield, She could see him through the window of the corner office, phone pressed to his ear, his other hand gesturing as he spoke to someone. Building his case. Making his calls. Katie recognized the posture because she'd worn the same one for 16 years during debriefs and after-action reports. He was constructing a narrative that would justify what he'd already decided. At 3:02 p.m., the monitors changed. Not dramatically. The beeping didn't accelerate or shift to a different alarm. But the rhythm compressed, the PR interval shortened, the QRS complex widened, and Katie's breath caught because she knew what was happening. The scar tissue had moved far enough to compromise blood flow. His heart was beginning to struggle. His oxygen saturation dropped to 94. Then 91. The rate climbed, 102, 108, 112. His blood pressure plummeted, 104/60, then 98/56. Not yet critical. Not yet the kind of numbers that would automatically summon the crash cart. But the pattern was unmistakable. Scar tissue near the heart. Shifting under the pressure of his own heartbeat. Cutting off blood supply. Triggering the cascade. Katie made her calculation in the space of 1.7 seconds. The code team was occupied. The backup team was coming from 2 buildings over, minimum 5 minutes. Dr. Whitfield had just been the one who'd written the order that made this veteran untouchable. And she had 16 years of combat medicine training that no civilian nurse should possess, and the veteran was dying in front of her monitors, and her son was 3 months dead because this man had led an ambush that went wrong, and the challenge coin in her pocket was the last thing her son had ever given her, and she made the only choice that mattered. She pulled the crash cart into the hallway. Moved the veteran's bed into the open corridor. The lights were bright enough to see everything. The space was open enough to work. And she cracked his chest in full view of 3 nurses, 2 residents, and a custodian who'd been mopping near the water fountain. The scalpel from the crash cart was sharp. The incision was clean. She opened along the 4th intercostal space with the precision of someone who'd done this without gloves in field conditions, her hands moving on their own because muscle memory took over, because her body remembered what her civilian credentials were trying to forget. She spread the ribs with a rib retractor that clicked open like a weapon being loaded. The pericardium was visible. She opened it. And there was the scar tissue, thick and angry, pulling tight against his heart like a fist, compromising the right coronary artery, shutting off blood supply to the right ventricle with the efficiency of a tourniquet. She performed direct cardiac massage. Her hands literally inside his chest, fingers wrapped around his heart, squeezing with the rhythm she'd learned in Kandahar and Jalabad and every forward operating base where the surgeon was an hour away. The hiss of the defibrillator charging. The sound of her own voice, a voice that had dropped 2 octaves, a voice that carried command authority no nurse should possess, calling out compressions and medications with the cadence of someone who'd given those orders 100 times. Push 1 of epi. 2-liter normal saline wide open. Get me a 4.0 endotracheal tube. The residents froze. The nurses moved. Her hands didn't stop moving. In, squeeze, release. In, squeeze, release. The rhythm was steady, methodical, shaped by training that had nothing to do with bedside manner and everything to do with keeping bodies alive when everything was trying to kill them. 12 minutes. That's how long she kept his heart beating while her hands were literally inside his chest, while she performed internal cardiac massage with the technique they taught in SEAL courses, with the knowledge she wasn't supposed to have, with the precision that could only come from doing this before while the sound of mortars echoed outside the tent. His rhythm stabilized. The cardiac output returned. His oxygen saturation climbed from 86 to 89 to 92 to 95%. His blood pressure rose from the 60s back to 72/48, then 80/50, then 88/54. Stable enough. Not good, but alive. She began closure. Pericardium first, then ribs with surgical sutures she tied with the knot she'd learned in a trauma course at Walter Reed, then skin closure, and all the time her hands were steady, covered in blood to the elbows, her face a mask of concentration that revealed nothing because that's what she'd been trained to do. The room had gone absolutely silent except for the monitors and the ventilator and the sound of her own breathing, which was controlled and measured and gave away nothing. She was halfway through the skin closure when the footsteps appeared in the hallway. Dr. Whitfield stopped exactly 3 feet from the open wound, his face transitioning from white to purple, his mouth moving without sound, and then the words came out as a whisper, "What the hell have you done?" Katie didn't look up from the suture. She tied the final knot. She dressed the wound with the movements of someone who had rehearsed every motion 1,000 times, and only then did she turn to face him. Her eyes met his. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of every year she'd hidden in plain sight. "My job," she said. Nothing more. And in that moment, Dr. Whitfield understood that he'd been standing next to something he'd fundamentally misjudged, that the nurse in front of him was something else entirely, that whatever investigation he'd begun that morning had just become the least of his problems. Dr. Whitfield's face darkened to something beyond purple as he reached the hallway, his body rigid with a rage that made the air itself seem hostile. Katie had just closed the sternum, scar tissue from Ramadi shifted back into place, bleeding controlled, heart rhythm returning to something resembling normal. The veteran's chest rose and fell under its own power now, no longer dependent on her hands. But Whitfield didn't see a saved life. He saw a nurse who had violated every protocol he'd ever written, who had performed emergency surgery without authorization, who had made him look like the obstacle he'd become. His eyes found hers for exactly 1 second. That was all it took. He turned and walked back toward his office with the precise, controlled movements of someone barely containing an explosion. Katie already knew what would happen next. She'd trained for this. 8 months of preparation meant understanding not just medical competencies but institutional power structures, the way authority moved through phone lines and email systems, how one well-placed call could dismantle a cover identity in hours. By 6:33 p.m., Whitfield's first call went to the hospital board chairman. A personal friend. Member of his golf club for 12 years. The conversation lasted for minutes. "We have a serious liability exposure. One of the nurses, Morrison, cardiac floor, performed unauthorized cardiac surgery in a hallway. No physician present, no surgical clearance, no informed consent from family. She's practicing medicine without a license, and when she fails, and she will fail, this hospital will face a 7-figure lawsuit." The board chairman listened. Whitfield's voice carried the certainty of someone describing an obvious threat, not a desperate accusation. Authority was in the cadence. By 7:04 p.m., the second call reached the State Medical Oversight Committee. A different tone here, official, measured, the voice of a concerned physician protecting the public good. "I'm reporting an incident of unlicensed medical practice. A registered nurse, Katie Morrison, performed an open thoracotomy, direct cardiac massage through an open chest, without physician supervision, without credentials in emergency medicine, without any legal authority to operate on human tissue. The patient survived by luck, not competence. This requires immediate investigation." The committee took his report. They always did. Whitfield was a board-certified cardiologist with decades of practice and an impeccable record, or so it appeared. His references were solid. His concern sounded genuine. His case sounded airtight. The third set of calls came at 7:16 p.m. Whitfield pulled Katie's employment file and dialed the 3 professional references listed on her nursing application. Dead phone numbers. Every single one. The first went to a voicemail box with a generic automated message that never identified the owner. The second was disconnected entirely. The third rang and rang with no answer. Whitfield hung up and immediately called back, certain he'd misdialed. Same result. Something flickered across his face then, not doubt, but something sharper. Suspicion. The kind that turns obsessive. A nurse with no verifiable references was already unusual. A nurse with no verifiable references who'd just performed unauthorized cardiac surgery was a threat that demanded investigation. He made 3 more calls that night. To board member Harris, 11 years on the executive committee. To board member Chen, appointed 6 months ago but connected to the right people. To legal counsel Brandon, who owed Whitfield a favor from a consulting contract 3 years prior. Each conversation was brief. Each one added weight. Practicing beyond scope. Credential fraud. Potential danger to other patients. Immediate termination recommended. By 8:15 p.m., Katie's email notification chimed. Administration. Immediate report. Pending investigation. Credentials and access badge to be surrendered. The message was for sentences. Formal. Final. Katie didn't fight it. She never would. Fighting would draw attention that undermined the entire operation. She walked to the nurse's station, removed her badge, the laminated photograph showing a deferential woman with soft eyes and her hair pulled back, and placed it on the counter. The charge nurse's expression shifted from confusion to something like concern, but Katie simply nodded and walked toward the stairwell. The badge clattered against the tile floor behind her, the sound echoing like a punctuation mark ending one chapter and beginning another. The hospital laundry room occupied the basement level, a cavernous space filled with the industrial smell of bleach and the hiss of steam rising from massive washing machines. Fluorescent lights hummed their constant, impersonal song. Rows of folded linen stretched across sorting tables, organized by department and care level. Katie moved to the corner where clean scrubs waited in baskets, sorted by size. She selected 3 sets, medium blue, the standard color she'd worn every shift for 8 months. Her movements were precise, methodical, the same efficiency she'd brought to every task in this hospital. Fold the sleeves inward. Match the shoulder seams. Create the precise rectangle. Fold again. The fabric still carried the smell of antiseptic, that sharp chemical edge that never quite washed out, that worked its way into your skin until you couldn't smell it anymore, until you became part of the hospital itself. She understood now what the nursing job had truly been. Not cover. Not a mask. The nursing job was the mission. 8 months of placement as Katie Morrison, registered nurse, unremarkable and forgettable, the kind of staff member doctors never looked at twice. That was how you could stand 30 feet from a Master Chief Petty Officer and track his vitals without raising questions about why Navy intelligence had an interest in a retired officer at Seattle General in San Antonio. That was how you moved through hospital corridors without anyone asking why a career military operative was folding linens and taking orders. The veteran, old man, had been her assignment. Protect him. Monitor him. Stay close enough to intervene if the system failed him. And the system had failed. 7 doctors in a single afternoon, each one declining to treat a deaf patient with complicated cardiac pathology, each one citing liability and policy, each one adding another brick to a wall designed to let the veteran die without lifting a finger. Katie had made her choice in that moment. The nursing job had ended when she performed battlefield medicine in a civilian hospital, when she showed her hand instead of protecting her cover, when she made clear that she was something other than what she appeared. And the veteran was stable now. Sedated in the intensive care unit, monitors tracking his oxygen and pressure, a full surgical team ready to move if his condition shifted. Mission accomplished. Career ended. By 8:45 p.m., she'd returned all 3 sets of scrubs to the laundry bin. She touched the challenge coin one final time, her son's coin, passed to her with instructions to keep the old man alive, and positioned herself to leave. The coin had stopped being a MacGuffin hours ago and become something else entirely, evidence of failure. She'd kept the veteran alive, yes. But she destroyed her career and compromised every other operative in the network by exposing her methods. She'd blown 8 months of careful placement for a single patient. The Pentagon would be unhappy. Command would be less than pleased. And she'd still have to report it all, somehow, once the helicopter showed up to extract her from this particular disaster. Then came the sound. Deep. Rhythmic. Wrong for this time of evening. One helicopter. Then another. Then a third. The rotor wash shook the basement windows hard enough that she heard emergency supplies rattle in the supply closets upstairs. Car alarms erupted in the parking lot. Through the reinforced basement windows, she caught fragments of sight, military helicopters descending toward the emergency landing zone behind the hospital, running lights painting the dark red and white across the concrete. Not extraction. Not yet. The sound was too coordinated. Too many aircraft for a simple pickup. Katie moved toward the stairwell, knowing exactly what had happened. The network had deployed. Someone at the Pentagon had decided that allowing a Master Chief Petty Officer to be terminated on false charges would damage institutional confidence in the entire intelligence operation. Someone had made the call to go public. Someone had decided that Katie Morrison's cover was worth less than the message it would send if she disappeared quietly. She reached ground level just as the lobby doors burst open. The sound reached them first, a low percussion that built from the south, grew louder, became unmistakable. Rotor blades cutting air. Not one helicopter. Multiple. The lobby doors had been heavy glass, soundproofed, but the windows rattled in their frames as the aircraft descended toward the parking lot. Nurses looked up from their stations. An orderly dropped a chart. The fluorescent lights buzzed their steady hum, indifferent to the disruption below, but the air itself seemed to change pressure, the kind of shift that comes when institutional authority is about to be rewritten. The doors burst open and the lobby filled with movement. Not the careful, practiced movements of hospital staff. Military movement. Organized. Controlled. A Navy SEAL commander led them through, dress blues, chest ribbons, the kind of bearing that made civilian authority instinctively step backward. Behind him, for enlisted personnel in Navy combat uniforms, faces neutral, eyes scanning. A two-star general followed, his uniform crisp enough to cut paper, and with him came the weight of federal apparatus, the kind that hospitals learn to obey without question. The commander moved to the nurse's station. He didn't ask. Master Chief Morrison. I need her now. By her call sign. The room didn't go silent. The room forgot how to breathe. Katie was 3 floors up, in the laundry room, folding her scrubs for the last time. The fabric still carried the smell of hospital-grade bleach and antiseptic, that chemical signature that clung to everything. She'd been practicing the motion methodically, smooth, practiced folds, the same way she'd done her service dress after Ramadi, after the ambush, after carrying 2 men whose names she'd never been cleared to use across open ground while rounds cracked the air around her head. The muscles remembered. The hands knew how to fold things away. Her phone buzzed. Page system. The code was urgent but the message was impossible. Katie Morrison. Report to lobby. Code Eagle 7. Eagle 7 was a closure protocol. Extraction protocol. The kind of code that didn't exist in civilian hospitals because civilian hospitals didn't have to accommodate military operations. She moved. The stairwell was empty. Her feet hit the steps with a steady rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 4, and she took them without rushing, without the theatrical urgency that would announce her presence. Just a nurse moving with purpose. Just a woman in scrubs whose 8-month mission was about to collide with her actual existence in front of 300 witnesses. The lobby doors opened and she stopped moving. The commander saw her and his eyes changed. Recognition. Not of her face. Of her bearing. Of the way she'd moved through that door, not approaching, but reporting. The distinction between a civilian and a soldier collapses in that single moment of movement, and every military person in the room felt it recognize itself. Master Chief Morrison, the commander said. Not a question. Katie didn't respond. She was already moving toward him, and that was response enough. But it was a veteran security guard, former Navy himself, maybe 60 years old, definitely recognizing what he was seeing, who spoke first. His voice carried through the lobby like a rifle shot. That's a Master Chief Petty Officer. That nurse is a goddamn Master Chief. The words hung in the air. Nurses turned. Doctors turned. Families in the waiting area, already anxious, shifted their attention toward this sudden gravity well. The security guard had gone pale, not from fear but from the realization of what he'd just witnessed, a woman in scrubs whom he'd probably passed in the hallway 3 times a week, who'd been invisible to institutional authority, suddenly resolving into focus like a photograph developing in real time. The commander's expression didn't change. "Admiral said you'd still be in scrubs. Couldn't convince you to blow cover until the casualty was secure." "The casualty is secure," Katie said. 10 words. Maximum. Her voice had changed. The nurses who'd worked with her for 8 months wouldn't have recognized it. The pitch was lower. The pace was military, not rushed, but clipped, every syllable serving a purpose. "We know. Come with us." The commander gestured toward the administrator's office. It wasn't a request. It was a command structured as an invitation, which was just a courtesy. They moved through the corridor, Katie, the SEAL commander, 2 enlisted personnel, and the 2-star general whose pairing seemed to warp the space around him. Doctors stepped back. Code status didn't matter anymore. The hierarchy had inverted. The general was operating in a jurisdiction that made medical credentials look like merit badges from summer camp. The administrator was already in the office. So was the state medical board representative who'd been triggered by Whitfield's formal complaint. So was Dr. Whitfield himself, pale, suddenly understanding that the situation had evolved beyond his control. The general closed the door. The sound was absolute, a closing that suggested whatever happened next would be documented officially. "Dr. Whitfield," the general said, his voice measured, "the investigation you initiated into Master Chief Morrison's conduct led Navy intelligence to conduct a full audit of your professional record." The general opened a file. Photographs. Documents. Financial records. "When you contacted military references and activated security protocols, you tripped a flag we've been watching for 18 months. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He tried to speak. The general continued. "So we looked deeper. All of your records. All of your decisions regarding veteran care at this facility." The general turned a page. 17 veterans refused treatment in the past 8 months. Each refusal documented with policy language you wrote. Each veteran subsequently transferred to the Mercy Heights private network across town. Each transfer generating consultation fees, speaking honorariums, and board compensation paid to you within 90 days. The room went still in that particular way that precedes collapse. "The scheme is straightforward," the general continued. "Create institutional barriers to treatment at the public hospital. Force families toward the private facility. Collect referral payments. You've generated approximately $320,000 from these transfers." Whitfield's face was darkening. "This is completely, the policies were medically justified." "The policies," the general said, "were fabricated. We have communications with 6 attending physicians showing that you personally briefed them on consent concerns that don't exist in medical literature. You created a consensus that didn't rest on clinical grounds. You did this to force the transfer of your patient, the deaf veteran from Ramadi, to Mercy Heights." The general closed the file. Instead, he was saved by Master Chief Morrison, who violated every protocol you'd constructed, performed emergency cardiac massage in the hallway, and kept him alive until the code team arrived. Whitfield recovered slightly. "That's exactly my point. She performed surgery without authorization. She performed battlefield medicine on a patient you'd abandoned," the general said. His voice hadn't changed in pitch or pace. That was what made it devastating. She was trained to do exactly that in Ramadi, where she saved 47 lives. Under fire. In 16 years of service as a combat medical specialist. The general pulled a second file from his briefcase. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 3 Purple Hearts. All of those earned before she became a nurse at this hospital. Whitfield's lawyer, where had a lawyer come from, put a hand on his shoulder. Too late. The trajectory was already written. "The veteran you refused," the general continued, "now stable on the 3rd floor, is surrounded by his operational team. They've asked me to share what they want everyone to understand." The general paused, and something shifted in the room's pressure. During the Ramadi deployment, Master Chief Morrison carried the veteran and 2 other casualties across open ground. Approximately 1 kilometer. Under sustained fire. The shrapnel that was meant for the veteran went into her right shoulder instead. That injury required 3 surgeries. That injury never fully healed. That's why her hands shake sometimes. Not from fear. From nerve damage. Whitfield was trying to stand. His lawyer was pulling him back down. The veteran also wanted to communicate that the man who led the mission in Ramadi, the mission where Master Chief Morrison earned her scars, was Master Chief's son. He died 3 months ago. In Ramadi. On an operation the veteran led. The general looked directly at Katie for the first time since entering the office. The Master Chief wasn't here to protect this patient because it was an assignment. She was here because her son didn't come home. And his commanding officer made it home. And she keeps her debts. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when institutional structure suddenly realizes it's built on sand. The State Medical Board representative was writing notes with focused intensity. The hospital board chairman had physically moved away from Whitfield's side, creating distance that would be reported to every board member within 24 hours. The administrator was making the calculation about damage control, which was irrelevant, because the military was already inside the building. The investigation into your conduct, the general said to Whitfield, is now a matter of federal review. Your medical license is suspended pending determination. The private hospital network is being investigated for healthcare fraud. And the fact that this entire situation occurred because you tried to suppress a Master Chief Petty Officer's attempt to save a life, that fact is going to be documented in every training file, every credential review, and every state licensing board database in this region. Whitfield's face had gone from red to a grayish color. He tried again. I have rights as a physician, I have authority in this hospital. You have approximately 24 hours to provide a written statement to federal investigators, the general said. After that, I'd recommend consulting with a criminal defense attorney. The general stood. His movement was a closing statement. The meeting was over. Whitfield's career was over. The investigation he'd launched, his weapon, his institutional authority, his carefully built network of alliances, had turned on him with 10 times the force because he'd aimed it at someone he didn't understand. Katie stood when the general stood. She didn't look at Whitfield. The composure she'd maintained for 8 months hadn't wavered, but something had shifted in her bearing. The invisible weight she'd been carrying had a name now, and the name was acknowledged. An acknowledgement carries its own gravity. Master Chief, the general said as they moved toward the door, your son was one of the finest leaders I've served with. You inherited his character. Katie's hands, still damaged from shrapnel that had been meant for a man who'd ordered her son into danger, steadied themselves on reflex. Thank you, sir. 2 years passed. Dr. Whitfield's medical license was permanently revoked after a 6-month investigation that uncovered 43 instances of veteran care refusal connected to financial kickbacks exceeding $312,000. The private hospital network was dismantled by federal prosecutors. The executives faced charges. And Whitfield, who had commanded authority and respect through institutional position, now taught CPR certification at San Antonio Community College for minimum wage, his fall from attending physician to demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic mannequin a daily testament to the mechanics of consequence. The San Antonio Veteran Center was polished and full. The deaf veteran, old man, was being honored at his retirement ceremony after 30 years of service. The room was packed. Service members in dress uniforms. Families. The small contingent of nurses from Seattle General who'd made the drive to witness what happened next. Katie Morrison stood in her dress whites. Full decorations displayed. No longer hidden behind scrubs. The Master Chief Petty Officer uniform fitted her the way a returning to truth always fits, like something that had been fighting to exist underneath the surface finally getting to breathe. The veteran was presented with his ceremonial plaque, his folded flag, and the traditional final salute. And then the commander asked if there was anyone the veteran wanted to acknowledge. The old man signed. The interpreter voiced it, "Bring Master Chief." Katie moved forward. The veteran reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. The tarnished challenge coin, the one Katie had carried for 8 months, the one her son had pressed into her hands with an instruction to keep the old man alive, the one she'd gripped in a supply closet when everything felt impossible, had been polished to a mirror shine. The veteran placed it in Katie's palm. And then he signed something else, slowly, deliberately, making sure the interpreter could translate it clearly for the assembled crowd. She kept her promise. Twice. The San Antonio sun caught the coin's polished surface and threw light across the assembled service members, families, and the small group from Seattle General whose presence testified that a nurse had become a legend without anyone noticing. Katie's face showed the same composure it always had, jaw set, eyes steady, hands at her sides, but there was something different now, a weight lifted by the completion of duty and the honoring of a debt paid in full. She shook the veteran's hand. Both of them in full uniform. Both of them carrying stories that wouldn't make the official record. Sometimes the person holding everything together is the one nobody's been looking at. Sometimes the quietest person in the room might just be the one saving everyone's life. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes walking among us, the ones who serve in silence, who sacrifice without announcement, who keep their promises no matter what it costs. Leave a comment if you've ever been underestimated. And remember, the military we honor isn't always the one in uniform.